So welcome everyone to Wetlands Why, What, When, Where, Who, How. My name is Rachel DeVos and I'm a Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the AUMA. Today's webinar is part of AUMA's Land Use Planning series, which provides the opportunity for participants to learn more about and discuss the land use framework and related policies and strategies. The series kicked off last fall with an update on the status of regional plans under the framework, the requirement for municipal compliance with those plans, and an overview of efficient use of land principles. We then hosted webinars on the connection between the land use planning and the preservation of historic resources. And if you missed any of these webinars and are interested in checking them out, I'll be posting links to them in the chat box in just a moment. So given the connection between land use planning and wetlands, in February, AUMA hosted a webinar to conserve and protect implementing Alberta's wetland strategy. During the webinar, Thorsten Hebben, Director of Surface Water Policy for Environment and Parks, provided an update on implementation of the policy and how municipalities can support its implementation. As well, Michael Barr, who is a coordinator of the Alberta North American Waterfowl Management Plan, introduced a new project to advance wetland stewardship in Alberta through municipal engagement. And I'll also be posting a link to that webinar in the chat box in case you or a colleague missed it. But we really realized that we only had 1 hour for that webinar, and it just simply wasn't enough to get into the level of detail and answer the questions that you have, both about wetlands in general, about the wetlands policy, and about the municipal role in implementing the wetland policy. So with the support of Tasha Blumenthal at the AMDNC, we solicited questions from Alberta municipalities, and Thorsten was kind enough to agree to join us again today to respond to your questions. And with that, I'd like to give a big shout out to all of you who took the time to submit questions, especially the municipalities who are part of Project Awesome in Central Alberta. And with that, I will introduce or reintroduce, for those of you who are on the last webinar, Thorsten, and we'll get right into it. So Thorsten Hebben is a director and former limnologist with the Water Policy Branch of Alberta Environment and Parks. In his 12 years with the department, Thorsten has worked on a wide range of surface water quality issues and topics, including long-term trend assessment, water quality index reporting, and organic wastewater contaminants. For the past several years, Thorsten has been leading development and implementation of various surface water policies for the province of Alberta, not the least of which has been the Alberta Wetland Policy. And with that, I will turn things over to Thorsten.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks also for the opportunity to come speak today. While I have the opportunity, I'd like to also acknowledge a number of the people on the call today, as well as the provincial municipalities that have taken the time to get in touch with me and our team over the past several months to ask questions and throw out challenges and so on and so forth. All of those conversations have been very useful, very rewarding, and quite instrumental in helping direct us as we implement the Alberta Wetland Policy. So I'm seeing a number of familiar names on the list today. Very briefly, Elisa from Wetland County, you've been, great to talk to. Ben, I think I still owe you a phone call, and a number of others as well. So keep it up, and I'll probably emphasize that a few times during the presentation today. We are open to discussion. We want to hear from you. We want to engage you, which is why I'm here today. So again, thanks very much, Rachel, for the opportunity to engage. A quick outline of my presentation. I'll note that the presentation hasn't changed an awful lot from the last time round. There is a little more detail on some points, and all of it is very much focused on on the questions that we received from you and others in response to the last presentation. So what I'll talk about is wetlands, their role and status in the province, to give you a better understanding of why it's important that we start to think differently in terms of how we manage our wetlands and how we include them within our planning processes. I'll talk about very briefly about the policy context. I think most of you will understand that already. And then I'll get into the management system and tools. And again, all of this is very much focused on the way questions were framed and some of the lack of clarity that appeared to be out there still. And then I'll talk about what's coming soon, or the next steps for wetland policy implementation, and really dwell on the partnerships piece again. What is a wetland? So just a brief reminder for those that don't have a full understanding, I guess, of the diversity of wetlands in the province. We do have 5 major classes and a whole range of additional types underneath those classes. So the point here is that we have considerable diversity, and there's a lot more than just that. What I like to call the Ducks Unlimited centerfold, sorry Milana, which is the bottom left there, the typical marsh with the duck floating down the middle and a couple of cattails poking out the side. Certainly an important type of wetland. A very prominent type of wetland, certainly in the wide area of the province, but there's a much greater diversity there as well. One of the questions we received: why are wetlands important to municipalities? In response to that, I put together a series of about 3 or 4 slides here. The role of wetlands on the landscape. To date, we've lost between 60–70% of our wetlands, and those numbers are old. Some of our more recent numbers are showing up to 80–90% of wetland loss in certain areas of the white zone of the province. Those losses are ongoing and to some extent unmitigated. So we have a water quality role on the landscape in terms of sedimentation, that is removal of particulates from runoff water, nutrient removal relative to phosphorus and nitrogen. That also tends to be present in runoff from agricultural land, for example, or forested lands, and contaminant removal in terms of pesticides, herbicides, pharmaceuticals, and metals. A really important piece here, water quality, is when we start looking at our recreational lakes as an example. So my expectation is that my team will in the coming months start working on a provincial lake watershed management policy in recognition of some of the challenges that we're facing relative to our major recreational lakes, or many recreational lakes in the province. Pigeon Lake being a really good example, Muriel Lake being a good example, a few others that come to mind as well, Lac St. Anne, for example, that are challenged with nutrient levels and water levels. And we need to start making the linkages back to how we manage our watersheds and how we manage wetlands. So oftentimes that's not entirely clear, and I think it's something that I'd really like to draw to the forefront as something that we need to be cognizant of and need to be managing for. From a hydrological perspective, water retention during periods of drought, as we've been experiencing for the past few years, that additional water on the landscape is incredibly important. Wetland removal will reroute that water and send it downstream to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, who might be willing to accept that water, but we might want to retain it a bit longer than we have been. Groundwater recharge and discharge, so water from precipitation over land flow is filtered, reintroduced into shallow aquifers. So that's part of the broader water cycle, and it goes both ways. Wetlands tend to be discharge zones in some areas, and they can be recharge zones in other areas. So if we have if we're challenged from a groundwater perspective, I think we want to be cognizant of the role of wetlands within that particular aspect of the water cycle. Certainly flood mitigation, so the flip side of the drought scenario. Holding that water back so it doesn't immediately run into our rivers, cause downstream flooding, magnify sort of those flood events and those flow events. We want to ensure that we do have the capacity to retain that water on the landscape and help clarify it, help reintroduce it into groundwater systems and so forth. Number 2 on the role of wetlands, biodiversity. So in terms of rare and threatened endangered species, waterfowl habitat, wildlife corridors, vital amphibian, songbird, invertebrate habitat, fish nurseries, and so forth. I think we're all aware of these. more so than the water quality and the water quantity piece, but also very important across the range of types. Typically we think of Class 1 ephemeral wetlands as not being important from this perspective, but when we start looking at it from the in terms of waterfowl and their use during periods of migration, if we think of it in terms of amphibians and their reproductive requirements, and even invertebrates and their reproductive habits, those shallow depressions that only last for 2 or 3 weeks during the spring, for example, can be very important. And then the human uses piece, from hunting, bird watching, traditional uses, and even grazing during periods of drought, stock watering during periods of drought. Wetlands can be very important from those perspectives. This is a sort of a diagram that I borrowed from the Beechwood Historical Alliance that I think does a really good job of in a simplified fashion demonstrating the importance of wetlands on the landscape. Again, why I think municipalities and more broadly Albertans should be concerned, interested, and proactive in terms of wetland management. So if you look at the top end of that diagram where it says dissipate stream energy, I mentioned that from a flooding perspective, it helps mitigate the downstream flows, the immediacy of those flows and the volumes of those flows, thereby mitigating the drought or the flooding impact. Contaminants and sediments are filtered, so they both drop to the bottom. They're filtered by the plants. Those aquatic plants actually retain a large proportion of heavy metals that we don't necessarily want in our drinking water. So from that perspective, from the perspective of pesticides and pharmaceuticals, all of those things can be retained within a wetland quite effectively. Critical wildlife habitat, and at the bottom end we've got cleaner water outflow and reduced flows. And then there's the groundwater linkages as well. Bacteria active in the sediments, removing contaminants like heavy metals and pesticides and so forth. Water storage for sort of long-term retention on the landscape. There's an interesting question there in terms of how that impacts agriculture. Are the soils adjacent to those wetlands, are they more productive? Are they retaining more moisture? Are they retaining more nutrients? On the latter end, most certainly those nutrients are retained. The drainage actually redistributes the nutrients into the downstream ecosystems. So again, from a producer's perspective, there are actual values to retaining a wetland in place. And then slow release of stored water over time. Why should municipalities be interested or concerned around wetlands? This is focused largely on the white area. There is some overlap with green area. It'll become more evident why it's laid out like this way a little later on. Point here is from a spatial perspective. What have we lost in terms of wetlands on the landscape since European settlement? So if you look at those pie charts, the green areas are what we have remaining. The dark green is what we have remaining. Light green is what we've lost. Not overly concerning. I mean, some of those are quite significant. I'd estimate on the order of about 40% loss of wetland area in a large proportion of the white area. If I shift it to the next slide, numbers lost becomes a very different sort of narrative here. The light area of those pie charts is what we have lost. The dark area is what we have remaining. So if we can just switch back and forth really quickly here, that's area lost. Dark area is what we have remaining. Light area is what's gone. This is numbers lost. Light area is what's gone, and dark area is what's remaining. And I think this latter slide tells a fairly comprehensive story in terms of what we've lost. If you compare it with the area charts, what we've lost is those very small, susceptible, at-risk wetlands. They're easily drained, they're easily plowed through, they're easily manipulated, and they're at highest risk, and they continue to be at high risk. And yet they're extremely important in terms of all those services that I pointed out earlier relative to water quality improvement, drought mitigation, or hydrology, so drought and flood mitigation, biodiversity, all those good things. I think this tells a very poignant story that we need to be cognizant of and that we need to be better equipped to manage. So these are the next series of questions, or this is the next series of questions that we received from yourselves. in response to the previous presentation and in response to some of the remaining uncertainty out there relative to wetland policy and its implications. First question, what is the role of the province in wetland conservation? To be very blunt, the province actually has a very limited role specific to wetland conservation. We do engage in a considerable range of activities relative to sort of landscape level conservation in terms of parks and other conservation mechanisms that incorporate wetlands. But in general, we don't specifically aim at wetlands as a conservation target. We currently do have an initiative underway that's seeking to ensure that at least 17% of the province is conserved or protected in some way, shape, or form. Parks being, as I mentioned, one of those mechanisms, others also being available to us, protected areas, conservation areas, and so forth. And that is a fairly ambitious undertaking that I think, since I'm not involved in it, I think I can commend it as a really positive initiative, and it will incorporate wetlands. But it's, as I mentioned, it's not specific to wetlands, which is in part why the municipal conversation is of such interest to me. So, in terms of ministries involved in wetland conservation and their roles. Maybe I'll take that ministries involved in wetland management and their various roles. I think in general, I would identify three primary ministries. First and foremost, obviously, being Environment and Parks. The second being Agriculture and Forestry, and the third being Municipal Affairs. Really, those are the, and to a much lesser extent, I guess, Transportation, who's done some really exceptional work around wetland construction and wetland restoration over the past few years. But generally, they come at it obviously from a road construction perspective and are fairly limited in scope, apart from the amazing work that they've done on the banking front. So, Agriculture and Forestry at present is a key partner for Environment and Parks, and we've been working very closely with them to establish a working group to address the private landowner challenges and the agricultural producers' role within wetland management, recognizing that wetlands are a bit of a oxymoron, I guess, for the agricultural industry, and present some really interesting and very real challenges that we need to be better equipped to manage. So that working group has been tasked with essentially two roles. One is to really clarify what the challenges are and how we might better address those challenges, and how we might make legislation, regulation, and policy more accessible to landowners and agricultural producers. We recognize that there are cost implications, that there are limitations in terms of how they can incorporate wetlands into their practices, into their landscapes, and acknowledging the need for a more efficient process that enables landowners to get involved in regulation. Steps toward alignment and communication. So that question was aimed at government relative to its interaction with municipalities and its enablement of the municipal relationship. So we have taken some significant steps forward on that front. I think the fact that I'm here today talking to you is a piece of that conversation for sure. And we're looking at other means of integration and alignment to the extent that we can. Step one in terms of alignment is at the regulatory level in terms of how we can better communicate at the regulatory level when an application for wetland development comes in. We've had some initial conversation with the City of Edmonton as an example, looking at how we can enable that conversation to ensure that all three parties, that is the municipality, the applicant or the developer, and the province, are communicating along the same lines, that there's a common understanding of the roles and responsibilities, and that there's a common understanding of the potential for differential outcomes in terms of what municipality is looking for and what the province might be enabling in terms of a regulatory process. That piece is still under development, and the challenge there, as I think you're all painfully aware, is the differences in regulatory processes. We all have different approaches, we all have different processes, and they're not necessarily aligned or integrated, and they probably can't be aligned or integrated, but as long as there's a common understanding of the potential for different decisions on an application, and there's an understanding of the governance structure. So in the end, who has the final say or who has the authority to say no on a wetland development application. And in most cases, I think the municipality actually has that authority. It's not always entirely clear, and we're not always effectively communicating that to each other and the applicants. So I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that those roles, responsibilities, and that hierarchy is better understood on that front. In terms of steps to ensure legal enforcement, this one comes up frequently for us, and I think most of you will appreciate that there's a resourcing issue at play here as well. The fact that we're unlikely to get additional enforcement capacity at the provincial level is certainly a stumbling block, but we also need to be aware that there are compliance mechanisms in place that are exceptionally effective if we choose to use them. And I believe that question comes up later in the presentation as well, but it's stated along the lines of what can a municipality do when there's non-compliance on a wetland. And the simple answer to that, as hokey as it sounds, is called the 1-800 number. We do actually have an environmental hotline that is exceptionally effective in terms of dealing with these sorts of issues. I've had personal experience with that, where to my immense surprise, when I called a compliance officer, they told me in no uncertain terms, call the 1-800 number. So you can imagine my response when I, as a member of Environment and Parks, was told to call the hotline to report a non-compliance issue around wetlands. They didn't know that I was staff, and they phoned me back a few times to let me know where they were within that process and what the end result was. And I found it quite satisfactory. So I would leave that with you as sort of something to consider when you see some of these issues arise. So a quick policy overview. I'm not going to read it. We have a goal. We have 4 outcomes. I just point out, and I've done this in the past, I think, but in general, Environment and Parks is very active in terms of outcome number 3. We have limitations in terms of the other 3 outcomes. And that's really where we would like to focus on enabling our partnerships, enabling communication, enabling opportunities for municipalities to pursue their desired goals and objectives relative to wetlands within their jurisdiction. Concept of relative wetland value. The only reason I bring this back is because it'll come up again in the presentation later on in terms of enabling municipal objectives, desired outcomes, working in terms of a risk management approach, and acknowledging some of the challenges that you as land managers face within your jurisdictions. So on the left-hand side, again, we have that biodiversity or ecosystem health component that contributes to relative wetland value. We have the water quality improvement, or what we're calling hydrological health. That also is critical in terms of the role of wetlands on the landscape. I mentioned it early on in the presentation. Sorry, that was water quality. Flood reduction is hydrologic health. It's drought mitigation, it's groundwater connectivity, it's all those good things. And then there's the human values aspect, which also plays into the relative wetland value assessment. All of that offset against the abundance piece, which in a nutshell, in areas of high historical loss, low current abundance, we might want to elevate relative value. In areas of high abundance and low historical loss, we probably want to acknowledge that there's a more balanced approach that needs to be considered in terms of both the environmental, the ecological, the economic, and the social considerations around wetland management. All of those pieces playing over into the right-hand side of the equation, which is the relative wetland value piece, which has the potential to be a very useful decision-making tool in terms of landscape level planning. The hierarchy: avoid, minimize, replace. Again, the reason I bring this up, generally speaking, within a regulatory context, we've built in additional tools that require applicants to demonstrate consideration of avoidance and minimization within their application, and that demonstration has to be solidified, or the rationale has to be stronger for higher value wetlands. At the end of the day, if there's strong rationale, justification for removal of the wetland from the landscape, we're moving to the replacement option. And this is really where I would like to see enhanced engagement of those municipalities that are interested in being part of the conversation, that want to have stronger influence on the regulatory decision-making process in terms of the avoidance piece. And I'll get into it a little later on as well, but I think there's a huge potential, a huge opportunity for those that choose to become involved in the discussion. Which leads to the next set of questions. What is the municipal role in wetland management? What are the responsibilities? In a nutshell, except for the municipalities that are actually a regulatory applicant under the Water Act or Public Lands Act, there is no responsibility, there is no requirement, there's no mandate. I want to be very clear that this is optional, and it's looking for voluntary engagement at the municipal level with the processes, with the tools that we've put in place. So I see it as I mentioned earlier, as a phenomenal opportunity for enhanced relationships, for enhanced communication, and for enhanced opportunities to work toward municipal objectives and goals in terms of wetland management, and in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of broader lake watershed management, river watershed management. I really think this is working towards sort of the next step in landscape level management in terms of seeking outcomes, managing towards mutually desired outcomes. The municipal role in wetland management. So again, I see it as an opportunity, and I see it as a need on our end to help ensure that the municipal objectives are being met. The enablement of that role will get us to where we desire to be, if that desire is present. Municipal objectives and plans versus Water Act approval. So there appears to be a dichotomy potentially between what the municipality is seeking in terms of wetland management and what the Water Act is approving in terms of wetland development applications. And again, I think we can overcome that through enhanced communications. The words here used in this question were steps to improve planning, and we're taking a long, hard look at what those steps are. So what are the tools? Where are the repositories for information? How do we enable the communication of that information from the municipality to the provincial governments so that our decisions are made within the context of the desired municipal outcomes? And I think there are a number of mechanisms through which we can achieve that. Some of them are fairly clear, and some of them have yet to be clarified. And I'll touch again on those a little bit later in the presentation. What is the appropriate municipal response to a drainage complaint? As I mentioned, again, it sounds a little ridiculous, but call the 1-800 number. It does work quite effectively in my experience. I'm sure others have had experiences where it may have lapsed on occasion, but in general, it does seem to be a very effective means of dealing with some of these concerns. So I didn't show this diagram in the last presentation, but what it is it's just a pictorial representation of a regulatory process. In stage one, there are a number of tools provided that enable a planning perspective, both in terms of the regulatory applicant and in terms of the land use planners. So I'll talk a bit about the tools a little later on. None of this is binding in any way, shape, or form. So these tools are not legal in nature. They're really information pieces that anybody who's out there on the landscape, putting in an application, looking to conserve wetlands, can apply in their decision-making processes. Stage two is the actual regulatory process. So at this point, this is where the boots hit the ground. This is where we get some legally binding information about the wetland, where it is, what it is, all of those components that lead to a relative wetland value assessment, or a relative wetland value that can then go into our regulatory process and will determine the decision-making process around an application. So some of these tools, again, can be quite or will be quite useful back towards stage one in terms of planning, in terms of putting some protective caveats around wetlands, around wetland complexes on the landscape within a municipal jurisdiction. Stage 3 is the actual submission of an application. We call it the Wetland Assessment and Impact Report, so it comprises all those pieces that were put together in Stage 2. And this is really around the regulatory process. And this is where kind of the rubber hits the road in terms of the provincial conversation with the municipal jurisdictions. We've heard loud and clear from you folks, from your colleagues, in terms of some of the challenges that we've had historically relative to wetland compensation, relative to wetland restoration activities, where those are happening, where there's perceived migration of dollars in wetlands from one municipality to the next, and so forth. There was a verbiage issued from the Alberta Association of Municipal Districts and Counties in terms of the need for municipalities to become what we call wetland restoration agents at the time to help minimize that. We've built a different system that is very much dependent on information in. So within our wetland mitigation directive, we've explicitly identified that wetlands need to remain in place. Where there's a loss incurred as a part of a regulatory approval or regulatory authorization, we would expect the wetland restoration activity to happen as close as possible to that loss. To make that happen, we need information. We need a prioritized list of wetland replacement activities that could happen in the vicinity of that loss. And really that's where I think the relationship comes into play. If we have the tools in place for the municipalities to communicate their needs, their desires to us, and we have a repository for that information, we have a hierarchical or criteria-based list that we can choose from, we can ensure that the desired municipal outcomes are achieved. And really, again, this is where a huge focus has come into play relative to enabling the overall system. Replacement proposal I'll talk about just very briefly is that we have a number of options on the landscape where before it was simply an in lieu payment for the wetland loss. We now have the ability for the applicant to actually engage in their own wetland replacement activity. So if they want to restore on a wetland on a piece of property that they own, they could potentially do that. If they want to purchase a pre-existing wetland offset, they could potentially do that as well. And the option to pay an in lieu fee remains. How can municipalities identify wetlands within their boundaries? That's a really good question. I'll answer that shortly. And how do municipalities share wetland inventories and conservation priorities with the province and wetland replacement agents? That question is also a very good one. It's one that comes up very frequently, and I think it's a very valid question where a number of our municipalities, off the top of my head, County of Leduc, Town of Chestermere, many others, Parkland County, have done inventory work and are very eager to have that great work incorporated into our provincial inventory. And we're talking about that right now from a number of different perspectives. So I guess on that front, what I would offer is a stay tuned. I expect something to come fairly soon, in a number of months, through a process that we've initiated with the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. The expectation there is that we will start looking at standards and criteria for wetland inventory in the province. The hope is that we can ensure that everybody who's out there doing inventory work is doing it to the same standards using similar data sources, such that we can readily put those pieces together and improve our own existing inventory. And then the conservation priorities, I think I mentioned that, but just to touch on it briefly again, I think we do need mechanisms to ensure that those conservation priorities are communicated back to us. I would take it one step forward and further and say it's not just about the priorities, it's also about looking at the mechanisms and tools. And that question was asked. It will be addressed later in the presentation, but it's really what do the municipalities have at their disposal, what do watershed planning advisory councils have at their disposal to conserve wetlands, existing wetlands on the landscape. How do we apply those tools, and then how do we communicate the fact that they've been applied back to government? So the provincial wetland inventory. This is how you would. This would be the initial step in determining where the wetlands are located within your jurisdiction. So this is just a quick screenshot of GeoDiscover Alberta. If you look, you can see you can see the quarter sections there. You can see where the wetlands are located. You can't tell based on the hatch marks that are in those wetlands what class of wetland it is, but if you were actually to drill down a little further, you can see what class it is at that 5 class level. It's not perfect. If you look sort of at not quite the top, well, at the top, not quite the very right, maybe a quarter section and a half in, it looks like there's a wetland there that's not been identified. And that really goes back to the inventory question. What we've put out there is not perfect by any means. It's intended to commit the GOA and its partners to continuous improvement within the inventory realm. We need to ensure that we have mechanisms in place for regular refresh and improvement to a higher resolution, to greater level of detail of what we have. So this would be a starting point. This would be an opportunity for the province or a municipality, a WPAC or stewardship group to have a look at their jurisdiction and figure out where the wetlands are, what the class of that wetland is, where the greatest density might be, and so forth. So I think it's a really good opportunity to at least take a high-level look of what we have available to us. If we take that to the next slide, we have the relative wetland value estimator. This is an overlay on the inventory. On the right-hand side is what I see. Unfortunately, the public-facing side doesn't have that level of detail in it. Instead, it would be the left-hand screenshot that would be available to somebody using GeoDiscover Alberta. And what those pie charts show is a relative value distribution. So that brown and orange pie, I can't even see it here, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on your end. I believe the orange component is the proportion of A's within the section, and the brown component is a proportion of D's within that section. Again, that can be used as a very effective initial planning tool to start identifying where one might want to focus conservation priorities, as well as eventually restoration priorities. So the intent is to modify the tool so that it would also predict the relative wetland value of a restored, currently drained wetland. Just to quickly answer Susanna's question there, are you referring to the Regional Wetland Objective Project through NAWAMP? I am not. That's a separate project. It is important, and it is intended to help inform partners, including municipalities, around objective settings. So what kind of tools might be used, what the priorities might be, and so forth in terms of prioritizing wetlands for conservation and for restoration. I believe at the moment it's very much focused on waterfowl outcomes and water bird outcomes, so it neglects a very broad range of the functions that wetlands provide. But we are moving to a sort of more integrated, broader spectrum approach that I think will be very valuable at the end of the day. Next question was what is the cost of wetland replacement? It's one that I hear, as you might imagine, quite frequently, and it is a very good question. It's answered within the Provincial Wetland Mitigation Directive, but I've brought it back here to just to refresh us on what that means. So if you look at the shaded relative wetland value assessment units, for the most part, as I indicated previously, those fall within the white area of the province. Each one of those relative wetland value assessment units has a wetland replacement cost associated with it or assigned to it. Those costs, as I've indicated, range from about $17,000 to $19,500 per hectare. And they are modified by the replacement ratios. So I didn't put the replacement ratios in the presentation, but the D value is a 1-to-1. So if you're in an area where it's going to cost you $20,000 per hectare, and I'm just making the math easier for myself, we don't have a $20,000 per se. If there's an area where it's $20,000 per hectare, and it's a D-value wetland, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. We're looking at $20,000 per hectare straight. On an A value, it would be 20,000 times 8. So it's $160,000 per hectare on an A value wetland. Obviously, that is intended to be a disincentive for wetland removal. A B value would be a 2-to-1, and a C value would be a C value would be a 2-to-1, and a B value would be a 4-to-1. Milana, I think I'll get to your question a little later. Do municipalities have a mandate to undertake wetland management under regional plans, land use framework? Well, maybe I'll answer it now. Actually, the answer is I'm not sure. I think that's part of the Regional Advisory Council conversation. It's a good question. It's one I'll take back to my colleagues that are working in the Land Use Framework branch. I think there are opportunities there to integrate, and I think there's a very powerful tool under ALSA, the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, to identify prioritization of wetland conservation and to actually conserve wetlands. How that conversation is enabled, like I said, it might be partially through the Regional Advisory Council. I know the municipalities to some extent sit on those councils. But I would have to.
This is Rachel here. I can jump in as well. I think one of the ways that municipalities are impacted in terms of the land use framework, regional plans, and wetlands is that, for example, under the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, wetlands are identified, conserving wetland is identified as an objective. I think there's more work to do there in terms of setting very specific objectives, but I think what a municipality will want to do to ensure they're in alliance with the regional plan is to ensure that as they're making decisions that they're considering wetlands as they're making land use decisions and documenting those decisions. So although right now there's not kind of specific targets, I think municipalities will have to start integrating wetlands more and more into land use planning decisions so that when 5 years after a regional plan has been introduced and you have to submit your declaration of compliance to the stewardship commissioner, you will need to be able to document that you have at least considered wetlands as part of your planning process. And it's kind of like the 12-step program, that consideration is the first step towards conservation. So I hope that helps. And we do know with the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan that is anticipated to come out at any time now, that wetlands are one of the primary priorities of that regional plan. So it'll be really interesting to see what's included there, but I think that when that comes out, we'll all be interested in looking through that and seeing what direction it provides.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Next question from Jane. Can municipalities use these tools through GeoDiscover to determine if a development or subdivision that is being proposed should be referred to Environment for Water Act approval? To be explicitly clear, Jane, that's a really good question. But going back to my previous comment, the GeoDiscover tools are not legally binding. They're to be used for planning purposes, so they can be used as a preliminary reference, but they don't have the clout to be used as you're suggesting. Ideally, we'd like to get them there at some point in time, and that's about that continuous improvement conversation. For the time being, I think they can be used as a tool to start the conversation. Certainly if the, thanks Dale. Yeah, as Dale says, at the end of the day, on-the-ground trained professional would be needed to make that final determination, but certainly it could be used to raise a flag and at least initiate a conversation. Tools and opportunities. So, I need to refresh myself on the question. No, it was just a cost of replacement. Okay. There's a wide range of science-based operational tools that are completed and active. And I'll come back, I think, to a few of these. But we do have the inventory and map of estimated relative wetland values, so I mentioned those. There's the actual relative wetland value tool. That's the site-level assessment that Teo's referring to. So we need a trained professional to go out and use this and identify the class of wetland, the boundary of the wetland, the relative wetland value, and so forth. And then the key guidance pieces. These are all available on our website. So I mentioned the Wetland Mitigation Directive earlier. That'll have the cost for your specific jurisdiction based on relative wetland value assessment unit. There'll be the Alberta Wetland Classification System, the Identification and Delineation Directive, all of these tools that help inform a comprehensive, detailed, thorough regulatory process. Many of those tools also have aspects that can be used for planning purposes, that can be used to inform decision making at a municipal level, certainly within the municipal planning context. I think there's a great deal of opportunity there. Again, there's no mandate, there's no requirement from a planning perspective. However, I think there's need, and certainly there's opportunity for those that are interested in pursuing that. And I know at the municipal level that can be a really difficult conversation, not unlike the challenges that we have at a provincial level between administration and the political layer. And then there's the wetland application checklist, and I'd really encourage folks to take a look at that application checklist. That is not a binding regulatory tool per se. What it attempts to do is identify the potential requirements on a regulatory process. So it raises flags for the applicant to ensure that they're meeting their obligations across the board. So not just the provincial regulatory process, also the municipal process, also the federal process, all of the considerations that should come into play on a development application. So it's an attempt to intercept gaps at the outset, to intercept attempts to perhaps circumvent certain regulatory requirements, which we know happens on occasion. What I'd really like to ensure is that we've captured the sorts of considerations that you at the municipal level are cognizant of, that we may not have necessarily considered when we put that checklist together. Again, all of this is on the website, so if you Google Alberta Wetland Policy Implementation, it'll take you straight to that website, and you can open these tools, you can manipulate them, look at them, whatever piques your interest. What funding and resource support is available for education programs, incentives, and inventory? I think I'll probably talk to that on the next slides. Wetlands that are identified for restoration, how should we respond? Probably on the next slide. And status of the qualified wetland science practitioner. Can a municipality become a qualified wetland science practitioner? Okay, so like I said, I'll encapsulate those questions within these bullets here. But key points are that we have a number of items that are nearing completion. One of which is the Wetland Restoration Design Protocol. So that's part of our broader conservation offset system. The wetland component of that offset system will have a number of protocols underneath it. One is the Wetland Restoration Protocol, one will be the Wetland Construction Protocol, one will be the Wetland Conservation or Securement Protocol. And I think there's a third that's not coming to mind, the enhancement protocol potentially. And we also have competencies and practice standards for the qualified wetland science practitioner. That piece is specific to individuals. So the question was, can a municipality become a qualified wetland science practitioner? The answer to that is no. However, a municipality may have a qualified wetland science practitioner on staff. In fact, the expectation would be that those municipalities looking to become more involved in wetland management, particularly from a restoration perspective, would have a qualified wetland science practitioner on staff. So it's not a requirement, it's an opportunity. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. The qualified wetland science, that designation is being or has been developed in conjunction with the professional regulatory organizations in the province. So those are the agrologists, the biologists, the foresters, the forest technologists, the engineers, the engineering technologists, chemists, and a few others have helped us design standards and qualifications for those professionals that would be seeking the ability to sign off on regulatory applications for wetland development. Also on the wetland restoration side, they would have the ability to sign off on the various steps of wetland restoration. So this doesn't prevent anybody from engaging in wetland assessments, for example. However, they would not necessarily have the ability to sign off on those assessments if they don't bear this designation. That is, they're not competent in the practice area as deemed by the professional regulatory organization. So as I mentioned, they are actually complete. There's a draft version that is currently being reviewed by the professional regulatory organization. So if you're a member, you may have the ability to provide your input. Each of those organizations is dealing with this separately in their own way. So some might have very specific, limited groups of people that actually are able to review those draft competencies and standards. Others may be going more broadly. I don't have an awful lot of authority over that. I also don't have the ability to distribute the documents. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to go back to your professional regulatory organization if you are a member. Key items under development: the provincial wetland replacement account. So that one goes back to, and I'm just going to go back a slide here. What funding and resource support is available for education programs, incentives, and inventory? And that would speak to the account. So part of the account, up to 10% of it, can be reallocated to wetland science and research, wetland education and outreach, and wetland inventory work. What would happen there, or what we're currently working on, is our criteria that will help determine what is eligible for funding and what is not. So as you might well imagine, when an account like this becomes available, the academic institutions, as an example, become very interested in acquiring money for research purposes. The onus is then on the province to determine how to select projects for receipt of monies from this account. Obviously, we have an accountability to Albertans. We have an accountability to the Auditor General of Alberta to ensure that we are spending our money wisely and in alignment with wetland policy requirements. So we have, through the Alberta Land Institute, we've been involved in a prioritization project for wetland science and research. I expect we'll be doing a similar thing for education and outreach. And as I mentioned, we'll be talking about inventory as well and what that might look like. So it might be a matter of allocating funds to an individual entity, such as a municipality, for example. Or it might be a matter of the province providing that inventory across the board for everybody. And I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have to help elucidate how best to approach that particular piece. But in short, that provincial wetland replacement account will have the ability to enable some of those mechanisms that were in the question. Particularly relating to the science, the education, and the inventory piece. The incentives component is a little in the air at the moment, but I suspect at some point we will have that conversation as well. Process for wetland replacement entities to act on behalf of the province. Notice I've changed the verbiage here. We used to call them wetland replacement agents, but there may not be a need for agents. The qualified wetland science practitioner designation may actually take the place of an agent. It may simply be a contract between an organization, be that a consulting agency, an environmental non-government organization, or a municipality. It would simply be a contract between that body and the government of Alberta toward a wetland replacement activity. As long as there's a qualified wetland science practitioner signing off on the various steps in the process, that should fulfill the need without the need for a requirement for an actual designated wetland replacement agent. That's kind of where our thinking is at right now. That's what we're working towards. There are a few discussions that need yet to happen, but I expect that will be the solution. And then I mentioned the wetland science and education agenda as well. So I think that pretty much, the wetlands identified were for restoration. I spoke to that earlier, but I think we need a mechanism in place to ensure that the municipalities are able to communicate their wetland restoration priorities back to the province. That is a need on our part, and my sense is that's a fairly strong desire on the side of the municipalities. And I mentioned this previously in the previous presentation, but I think the municipalities and the WPACs as the entities, the bodies that have the closest relationship with landowners or the ratepayers, that have the forums for communication, are probably best situated to acquire that information and feed it back to the province to enable decision making. So when that wetland loss happens within your jurisdiction, we have the ability to immediately reallocate funds to a proposed wetland replacement project because we know where it is, we know the linkage, we have prioritization criteria in place, and we can make those linkages. Next set of questions, how to support and promote wetland avoidance at the municipal level. And I think I've already answered that in part. There's one piece missing through the Alberta North American Waterfowl Management Plan. There's a conversation going on there in terms of the education and outreach component, how better to integrate, how to ensure that we've got comprehensive packages that are available to all the appropriate entities out there on the landscape, be they environmental non-governmental organizations, be they municipalities. These tools should be made available. They should be consistent. They should be integrated, aligned with one another, so that we're all providing the same messaging out to Albertans, to proponents, to landowners in terms of the importance of wetlands, the regulatory requirements around wetland management, around wetland development, and so forth. So there's a fairly aggressive initiative underway there right now. I think the wetland replacement account can play into that. So some of the funds I mentioned, up to 10%, can go to something other than actual wetland restoration or wetland replacement on the ground. I think this is where that comes in. So those education programs, I think we should be in part equipped to help support those programs financially. Will municipalities be provided with greater legislative authority and revenue collection powers under Alberta Wetland Policy and the Land Use Framework? I can't speak to the latter component, that is the Land Use Framework, and where that's headed on that particular front. From a wetland policy perspective, the answer is categorically no. I think what we are looking to do is ensure that the legislative authority is informed by provincial priorities, that we have greater connectivity, greater alignment, greater communication, better communication to ensure that the municipal outcomes are met to the fullest extent possible. But we will not be changing the legislative authority on that front. I think there's and don't quote me on it, but I think under the Municipal Government Act there is some additional verbiage around wetlands that's being incorporated into that. Certainly we've moved it beyond simply swamps, which I think is the terminology that's been used to date within the MGA. As a sidebar, I was informed recently that Saskatchewan also uses the term swamps within their Municipal Government Act. My only question is who plagiarized off of whom on that front. Nevertheless, I think that verbiage is going to change, and I think there might be some additional clarity embedded within the MGA around decision-making relative to wetlands. So I'm quite hopeful on that front. I think we all know it's a very powerful tool if we choose to apply it, and I think there's a great deal of potential. Revenue collection powers, I think I've alluded to that already, but the creation of the wetland replacement account was a means of ensuring that desire around wetland, around revenue collection is actually enabled. So it's not so much about collecting the dollars themselves as ensuring that the desired outcomes are met in terms of wetland management within the municipal jurisdictions. So again, priority is to keep the wetlands in place. If we can't do that, if for example we can't identify a wetland restoration opportunity within your boundaries, then we start looking at perhaps some of the wetland research that's being proposed within your jurisdiction. So I know there's some work ongoing, for example, between I believe it's Strathcona County and University of Alberta and University of Calgary that have been having conversations around some innovative research that might be done there. And I think those are the sorts of opportunities that we want to be enabling first and foremost when we can identify that there's no wetland restoration opportunity within a jurisdiction, or that we might be wanting to balance that restoration with some research work and so forth. So again, the Wetland Mitigation Directive, that wetland replacement account, all of that has very much been designed with an eye on enabling the achievement of wetland management.
Okay, Thorsten, do you mind if we hop back for a couple of questions here? Benjamin had a couple of questions related to liability. So his first one was, what is the liability of a municipality if a wetland is not identified, a developer does not submit Water Act approvals, and a wetland is destroyed?
So in a nutshell, the liability on that piece falls squarely on the applicant. In that case, the developer would be liable. The compliance response, in the case that it is indeed identified or reported, the compliance response would be aimed at the developer, not the municipality. What is the liability of municipality if a wetland is identified, developer does not submit a Water Act, and a wetland is destroyed? Same scenario. It will come back to the developer. They have the Water Act liability. They also have the Public Lands Act liability. They bear that responsibility. It would come back to them, not the municipality. Next question was, can you clarify under the SSRP what are the municipal obligations regarding wetland management? We hear it's not mandated in one sentence,
okay.
but required in the
It's
SSRP.
a little bit
so
of nuance here. So under the SSRP, by 2017, the SSRP was adopted in 2012. So after 5 years, municipalities are required to submit a compliance document to the Land Stewardship Commissioner. Details of exactly what that compliance document are still being, I'd say, finessed, finalized. Tasha can jump in, or anybody else can jump in here. But overall, the implementation, if you go into the implementation of plan for the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, it sets out expectations of municipalities. For example, on page 109 and 110 of the SSRP, in the implementation plan, it states that municipalities are expected to, just let me scroll down so I get the exact wording here, identify and consider, based on available information, including information from the Government of Alberta, the values of significant water resources and other water features such as ravines, valleys, riparian lands, stream corridors, lake shores, wetlands, and unique environmentally significant landscapes. So I think that what that means is, as you're doing your area structure plans, even your municipal development plans, as you're doing approvals, that you've at least considered what are the water features in that area, what tools have we the potential to apply, and why or why not have we used them. And you might want to go back and listen to the webinar that we did, the recording of the webinar that we did back last September, when we kind of got the province straight and hear it straight from their mouth, the kind of the expectations that they have in terms of municipalities taking various issues around environmental considerations and considering them in planning. And what it's really about is, as you're going through the various planning process that municipalities are involved with, that you're at least thinking about, is there a wetland here, and have we looked at the various alternatives we have to preserve it, and writing that down, and then after 5 years of the regional plan coming into effect, that you can include that as part of your submission. So it's still a little bit muddy, because I think the province has some work to do to clearly define exactly how detailed they want that documentation to be. But I just think to kind of, to mitigate any risk, that it would be a good idea that as you're developing those municipal plans in particular, and I'm thinking area structure plan is one of those plans that comes up a lot as an opportunity to identify wetlands, that as you're developing area structure plans in particular, that you're looking at what's on the landscape and considering water features, including wetlands. So I hope that helps. Tasha, did you want to jump in and clarify at all?
Sure. I just would probably flag that a position that both AUMA and AMDC advocated for in the MGA review was a clarification around the definition of environmental reserves. And this will be something that both associations will be looking at to see what types of clarification are being provided as the legislation is hopefully tabled in the coming weeks. And that will be, like Rachel mentioned, one of the tools that municipalities can use to try and maybe address this question moving forward.
Okay, just touching briefly on Susanna's question. Generally speaking, I think it's outside of my jurisdiction here, but I think there's another piece there that should be identified. And the question is, what about the issues related to development authorities overturning municipal objectives and plans? I do want to emphasize that the municipal plan is statutory in nature, so if there's a wetland identified as environmental reserve or municipal reserve or whatever other tools are at your disposal, that is binding from the provincial perspective. So there shouldn't be a developer coming to municipalities saying that Environment and Parks has approved the removal of this wetland off the landscape, therefore I can go ahead and do that. I know it happens. It shouldn't happen, and you should be aware that you have the authority to overturn that decision. Essentially, what Environment and Parks has done is said, yes, based on the information available to us, we are okay with you proceeding with your development activity and paying, making an in-lieu payment or whatever for the loss of that wetland. But we didn't necessarily have the additional information on hand that's captured within the municipal plan that would actually supersede that decision and allow the municipality to retain the wetland if that is the intent. So I just want to be sure that that piece is brought to your awareness. To Jocelyn's question, if a municipality does not have a QUISP staff, can it partner with an adjacent municipality that does, based on a common landscape and the intent of becoming a wetland restoration entity? And I think, thank you, Jocelyn, that's a really good question because I think it really highlights the continued lack of clarity around what a wetland restoration quote-unquote agent actually is and does. I really don't perceive, I'm not sure, given the way the system is designed, why a municipality would necessarily want to actually engage in the wetland restoration work. So there is no status, there's no agent, the entity is even, the verbiage there is a bit off. It's simply somebody who is qualified engaging in a wetland restoration project. So in an ideal scenario or a simplified scenario, I would have a list of priorities for Strathcona, for example, in terms of wetland restoration projects, because you've gone out, you've engaged with your landowners, with your ratepayers, you know who's interested in restoring a wetland, and you've provided that list to us in a prioritized manner. So the next time a wetland loss happens within your jurisdiction, we already have the list. We can identify somebody to take on that project. All the QUISP would do is design a wetland, or sorry, design the restoration of a wetland. They would oversee the actual construction activity, if you will, or the restoration activity. So that might be the contouring of the basin, that might be the construction of an earthen plug on the drainage ditch, and then they would validate that the work has happened, and then they would verify somewhere along the way that the wetland is actually on a trajectory to a restored state. So again, I'm kind of struggling, if it's not clear already, in terms of why a municipality would want to partner with an adjacent municipality to make that happen. That would be, I think, unnecessarily complex, and there wouldn't be any net benefit to any of the parties involved, in my mind. Perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps it's something that we should talk about further. Beaver Hills Biosphere may wish to become a wetland restoration entity. QUISP responsible may reside with only one of the partnering. Loss may be in Strathcona. Restoration could occur in Beaver counties. Yeah, so in that case, it would be a proposal from that municipality that actually has the QUISP on staff would submit a proposal for the desired project. And make the linkages to all 4 municipalities. So there's a partnership inherent there, certainly, and I laud that or applaud that and encourage it. I think there's a lot of potential there if there's collective value to be derived from that. But I would propose that perhaps that municipality that has the QUISP on staff would simply oversee the project because they have the expertise and the knowledge. So yeah, I guess, yeah, the answer is kind of a partnership there, but in principle and not so much on paper. As long as we have that proposed project, that desired project on the books, we can make it happen. Partnerships. Land use planners and land managers are critical to broader policy success. And I've brought this up several times today, and I brought it up in the previous conversation. And I really think it's key to us achieving, at a provincial scale, the other 3 outcomes of the Alberta Wetland Policy. those key partners in no particular order, but a strong emphasis on municipalities, as well as the watershed planning and advisory councils, the stewardship groups, and then the regional, sub-regional planning processes within AEP and with our partners as well. Those wetland assessment tools are designed to support risk management and land use planning. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but I wanted to bring it to the forefront again. The way we've designed the tool, particularly, well, both tools, I guess, the landscape level estimator and the on-the-ground ABRET actual, the Alberta Wetland Rapid Evaluation Tool actual, are designed to be picked apart so that we can better enable outcomes at the local and regional scale. So in other words, one could put a priority on that hydrology piece. So for example, we might know that there are flood-prone areas within your jurisdiction that we might want to better manage the water for. So we can start looking at wetlands for conservation that provide that service, or wetlands for restoration that are instrumental to managing overland flow and minimizing sort of flood scenarios. Similarly on the drought side, or the groundwater side, or the biodiversity side, and so forth. It is really looking at what your risk management scenarios look like, what your challenges are, where your emphasis needs to be, and how we can go about addressing those key issues in partnership, in collaboration with you. And that really should inform our restoration prioritization. For example, when a loss happens within your jurisdiction, you have for example, again, a flood issue, flood concern. Where do we put that wetland back to help minimize that flood piece? So that really informs your conservation and protection priorities relative to wetlands. The other piece I mentioned earlier, lake management. So where can we start thinking about putting lakes back? Where can we focus our efforts? Where can we focus our landowner engagement conversations to start putting wetlands back to help minimize nutrient flows to Pigeon Lake, for example, to help maximize water retention within the basin of Muriel Lake, and so forth. What tools do municipalities have to conserve wetlands? You're asking the wrong guy. But that having been said, as I said, the local and regional land planners or managers are best situated to make decisions around wetland management. They best understand the landscape. They know the challenges. They know where the drainage has occurred. They know where the highest density of wetlands is. They have the ability to use those tools, and some of those tools might be the MGA and bylaws. I'm thinking bylaws are probably fairly effective within that domain if we choose to use them, depending on what that looks like and how we implement them. I mentioned earlier the lake watershed management framework that we're likely to attack in the coming months. I suspect the MGA and the bylaws will probably play into that quite heavily, and it's a need to engage in conversation, to expose the opportunities, to clarify the roles and responsibilities, and how we might better integrate the various tools towards some commonly desired objectives and outcomes. And I think the wetland conversation not only plays into that, but is also influenced heavily by that discussion. I mentioned municipal development plans. They are statutory in nature if we choose to apply them, and I know a number of municipalities have been very effective at doing that. They are instrumental in those decision-making processes, and ELSA as well. Susanna has asked, how do you see WPACs involved as support to municipalities and other roles in wetland management and assessment? Can WPACs be involved in? WPACs know the lakes, they know the rivers, they know the challenges. They can help prioritize, they can help identify the needs. Again, I think that's part of that broader integrated conversation, which is why I'm really excited about the lake management discussion. Wetlands are part of that. Wetlands play heavily into that. And wetlands will be a key tool, and I think really the WPACs will be instrumental in those decision-making processes, in informing the decision-making processes, and in being part of the conversation. The piece that's missing are the the watershed management plans. And really that I expect will fall out of that discussion as well. And again, we'll link back to wetlands. So we know there are watershed management plans out there currently. What we haven't done particularly well is identify how they fit into the broader management context, into the broader legislative context, and the broader regulatory context. We need to find ways of making them more influential, more accountable, and more visible. And I expect that will be part of the discussion, and that will very much help us in terms of enabling enhanced wetland management. The second piece I have there are the discussions with partners. So obviously today's discussion is one of those. The WPACs, as we've just said, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, other environmental non-governmental organizations out there, your broader umbrella agencies, our touchpoint, our partners in the AUMA and the AMDNC. Inventories of wetland restoration opportunities and needs. That one's really key from a regulatory perspective. How do we enable the desired outcomes? It's one thing to collect wetland replacement. It's quite another to reallocate those dollars to wetland projects on the ground. And that's something that we don't necessarily have the resources to do ourselves. And we don't have the ability to do it in your best interests unless we're having the conversation, unless we've identified what your best interests are and how you would like to see things fall out at the end of the day. And then inventories of conserved protected wetlands. That one's really important. I kind of touched on it earlier in terms of your planning processes, in terms of your designations around wetlands, in terms of your decision making. It's great if you can do that, if you're interested in doing that, and if you're pursuing that. We need to ensure that that information is embedded within our regulatory processes as well, so that we don't, so that we're not cross-wiring ourselves, so that we're not at odds with one another, so that we're clear on what the desired outcomes are, and where those no-go zones might lie. So that's all about ongoing communication, collaboration, and alignment. I shared these key learnings last time, but they keep coming up for me. They're not surprising, they're understandable. And they extend into a whole realm of realities that people are challenged with, and that we need to be cognizant of, and that we need to work with. So there's a public perception of wetlands as wasteland. That goes back to the education conversation. How do we better communicate with our ratepayers? How do we better communicate with our regulatory applicants, our developers, our industries out on the landscape, our landowners, our agricultural producers? Wetlands are not wasteland. I think most of us on the call are well aware of that, but we need to move beyond that mentality. We have continued promotion of straight line tillage, straight line agriculture, minimizing turns, minimizing overlap, so on and so forth. And we've got an agricultural industry, service providers that are promoting these things. We've got high-tech equipment out on the landscape that is running in accordance with GPS software that's telling them to keep going straight when there's a wetland in the way. Unfortunately, that software is not cognizant of its regulatory and legislative accountabilities. I don't think it's too concerned about legal liability, where the landowners probably should be a bit more cognizant of those things. So there's a conversation there to be had with the sector, as well as the service providers. Incomplete understanding of regulatory accountabilities under the Provincial Water Act, and I think that's very much an education component. On the flip side of that, however, there's also a need to appreciate the agricultural producers side of that conversation. And I mentioned earlier, we're working on putting together a working group with the sector, with our colleagues in agriculture and forestry, to talk about how we find that balance. How do we enable retention of wetlands within agricultural landscapes? So that could be the incentive piece that was brought up in the questions. It could be an acknowledgement of what wetlands actually do for producers, so on and so forth. So there's a very intensive, thorough discussion that needs to happen there, and it needs to be creative as well in terms of making policy more accessible to landowners, while at the same time acknowledging that we can't have special treatment for landowners, for agricultural producers at the end of the day, recognizing that we've suffered the most severe losses within that particular sector. And at the same time acknowledging that the sector provides a huge service to Albertans and the public in general. Ongoing importance of partnerships, collaboration, prioritization, achievement of wetland conservation, protection, and restoration objectives. And this one is really key. And I need to emphasize this is for those partners that actually are interested in retaining wetlands on the landscape. So as was mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a dichotomy here. Recognize I speak from a wetland policy perspective. We're not mandating retention of wetlands. Under land use framework, that might look a little different. Under wetland policy, it's about enabling. It's looking at what the opportunities are, providing the tools, providing the mechanisms through which we can achieve those desired outcomes for those partners that actually do desire wetland-specific outcomes within their jurisdiction. Key messages, if I haven't hammered it hard enough, your outcomes are a priority. Your desired outcomes, your goals relative to wetland management. Subsequently, in a later conversation, lake watershed management, those are a priority for us. We want to ensure that we're enabling collaboration, we're enabling conversation, we're enabling the achievement of those desired outcomes, and that we're making our decisions, particularly from a regulatory perspective, but also within a planning context, in view of those desired outcomes. We want to keep wetlands within your boundaries. So, as indicated previously, that should really mitigate the desire for many municipalities to become engaged in actual wetland restoration on the ground. But at the same time, it should really open the doors to identifying what the desired outcomes are, where those priority wetlands lie, and ensuring that they are actually captured within regulatory processes across the board. This necessitates active engagement. I think that's fairly clear. The tools are responsive to risk management needs. I hope I've been clear on that. And really, management and success will depend on partnerships. Some supplemental questions, and I hear these all the time. They're valid. I understand where they're coming from, and I appreciate that they're being raised. So the first one is, what is the estimated time frame for Water Act approval? I know that in recent history, we've been delayed somewhat on our Water Act approvals. In large part, that was because of some of the same uncertainty that many of you have experienced relative to the Alberta Wetland Policy, its implementation back in June of 2015, what it means, what the requirements are, what the expectations are, and so on and so forth. Our wetland replacement agents had sort of the same questions and were reluctant to proceed until such time as they had sufficient clarity. So they have that clarity now. They're processing their agreements with applicants, and I think we're moving ahead much faster than we were previously. So I expect those lag times to be reduced. If they haven't already, they should certainly be in the immediate future. I cannot give you an estimated time because each Water Act approval is different. The level of detail, the level of supplemental information required will vary from one application to the next. So I can't give you a time frame per se. I can tell you that for wetland relative wetland value assessments, we are trying to keep them under 2 weeks. I know Public Lands Act Crown ownership determinations have been a key reason why we've had delays on some of our applications. I know we've acquired additional capacity on those assessments. We've also been tapping into other areas of the department to clear up a bottleneck. So on that front, you should also see reduced lag. I have to commend my colleagues in that domain. There's been a yeoman's effort to get things moving and to communicate to our executive level the need for capacity on that public lands front. So I think we're making progress there. What steps are being taken to reduce the time to approval? I think that just answered that question. We're really looking at efficiencies. The entire policy from a wetland perspective has been aimed at efficiency in process, while at the same time maximization of information and knowledge around decision making. So in terms of the avoid, minimize, and replace, are we doing our utmost to avoid, minimize where we may not have necessarily been doing that in the past? Are we fully considering the opportunities, the needs, and even more so with higher value wetlands? In terms of the minimization, again, what steps are being taken, additional requirement to demonstrate consideration of minimization steps at the higher relative value layers, and so forth. So we're not losing information, we're not losing due consideration. In fact, I think we've really gained on those fronts, but at the same time we're trying to ensure that we have an efficient system that's manageable, that's getting applicants through quickly and efficiency, and that's getting a decision in an expeditious manner. How do you see, oh, I thought that was another question, but it's not. I'm sorry. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Thorsten. Really appreciate you coming back to answer some of the questions since the last webinar and to get into some of the details. And we see that this continues to be an evolving process, and there's a lot of tools that are still under development that should help with municipalities playing that role and being a key partner in wetland conservation, and we really hope that some of that will be a lot clearer next week when the amendments to the MGA come out, and we will be, both AUMA and AMDNC will be doing our utmost to keep you up to date on that. And with that, just want to share that we do provide information on wetlands and all sorts of water issues at water.auma.ca, and the section on wetland management is under water management when you go to the watershed management when you go to that site. And again, both AUMA and AMDNC and Jocelyn, who's on the line from Strathcona, and the City of Edmonton are all working together to provide more resources in terms of providing municipalities guidance with what you can do to conserve wetlands. So look for that within the coming year. Also just wanted to let you know about upcoming webinars. One of the really key ones there is that we have an entire series of webinars on May 31st on the MGA amendments. So go to www.auma.ca/events to see. We have, I think, 5 concurrent sessions, or not 5 concurrent, 5 sessions on the MGA review on May 31st. So check that out and get registered. And we'll also be talking about the MGA at our June Mayor's Caucus in Olds, which you can also register for that there. And then, of course, again, at our annual convention. And I'll turn it over to Tasha, because I know she has some events, too, that she wants to let you know about.
Thanks, Rachel. For AMDC members, we will be traveling around the province in the first 2 weeks of June, hosting 5 different MGA sessions for each of our 5 districts. So if you haven't already seen that notification, please make sure you check out our contact newsletter. That'll be coming out today or tomorrow for the location registration information. We will be working with members to both help educate them on the MGA amendments, as well as to help us form our submission information for the Government of Alberta for the July 31st deadline. So just make sure you keep your eye out for that information, or you could give me a call or drop me an email at tasha@aamdc.com for any questions related to those MGA sessions. Thanks. And
thanks to all of you for being part of today. Another shout out to all of you in the Red Deer area from Project Awesome, who submitted a number of really excellent questions. Really, really appreciated that. And we'll keep these questions in mind as AUMA and AMDNC continues to work with the province and with with NAWAMP and everyone else to be a part of this. So thanks again, and just note that Thorsten just provided some additional information on the lower left-hand side of the screen there about the wetland replacement account, which will provide additional resources to support wetland conservation and restoration. And with that, unless there's any final words that either of you have, well, again, thank you for being engaged today, and I'm sure we'll be engaged with many of you on the call as the MGA amendments get rolled out. So thanks again.